got to tolerate me for just one more second. So you may have noticed you didn't see Terry around this morning. He and his wife are at a conference right now. They're taking some much needed time. So I would like to introduce to you Mr. Stephen Jones. Stephen comes to us from Cedar Falls. He is the director of Salt Company. He knows him better than I know him, however, so I'm going to let him fill you in on the rest of the things. But please say hi to Stephen for us.
Thanks, Brandon. Hey, it is great to be with you all this morning. Like Brandon was saying, my name's Stephen Jones, and I'm down in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I'm the Salt Company Director at the University of Northern Iowa. We're the ministry of Candeo Church down there. Started out at Iowa State. That's kind of my connection to the Salt Company, so I am friends with Saul. I know that he's come and preached here several times, and that's kind of the connection between Terry and I. And so it is awesome to be here with you today. So I'm married. My wife's name is Natalie. We've been married over 6 years. We have 3 kids. She's pregnant with our 4th, which is awesome. So we're super excited about that. Isla, Jack, and Crew are our 3 kids, and there's a fight over what the name of the 4th will be, and my kids have some creative names, like Corn Cob, and like Sparkle was thrown out last week, and so that is kind of what our household is thinking about a lot right now. But I love being up here in Clear Lake. I have great memories personally of coming up here and boating on the lake from time to time. We've actually spent, as a staff team of Salt Company, I've actually spent a lot of August preparing for the fall ministry sprint here in Clear Lake, camping, or I've stayed in the Pyramid Airbnb. It was a wild night. I actually broke in because there was a mix-up in our check-in time, and there's a lot of windows to the Pyramid house. And it's pretty easy to check every single one of them because you can scale all the walls. And that's what I did, broke in. And so if you ever want to get in there, check the back, go up to the 2nd floor. Those windows are usually unlocked. But we've spent a bunch of time up here in Clear Lake. My mom actually went to IRBC in junior high and high school, so that always has a fond memory for her. I know tons of students from Clear Lake, from Mason City, from Garner, Ventura. And so I was just telling Joe, I think that Garner is the biggest small town in Iowa because for the population it has and the number of people I know from Garner, I feel like at this point I know everyone from Garner because of how many Garner people I know. But anyways, it is great to be here. We love, so not only for personal reasons, but also because we have students. So Jonah Christensen's here. He's one of our servers down at Salt Company, serves almost every week, it feels like, in our tech booth. Kara Leglider, she babysits my kids every Tuesday night, leads a small group. 2 weeks ago, Jack, my 3-year-old, he found out that Kara wasn't going to be babysitting for him. And he was super upset. That's how much he loves Kara. And so, not sure if the Leglighters are here, but we love Clear Lake. But not only the students that come to us from churches and grew up in that environment, but I also think about students that I've come into contact from Clear Lake that aren't a part of a church. And so, Jacob is one of our student leaders, and we were just hanging out with a guy named Hunter on Friday night. And I've been getting to know Hunter the last 2 years. He's a junior at UNI. And last month I got lunch with Hunter. And he said, hey man, after confirmation in the Catholic Church, I was done. I had some questions that nobody seemed to be able to answer. And I was done. And so we're hanging out with him on Friday night. And he left early because he wanted to make sure he had enough time to get to the bars. And so not only do I think about the awesome students like Jonah and Kara, but my heart also breaks for the students like Hunter and Mac, who don't know Christ, who are from your guys' community that we're trying to engage with. And that really is the mission of Salt Company. We see kind of this just strategic opportunity that if you think about it, for 4 years, a significant portion of our state congregates in 3 places, in Cedar Falls, Ames, and Iowa City. And those 4 years happen to be some of the most critical years in a person's life. And our goal is to help those students who do have a strong faith, like Jonah and Kara, enter into college and have a church family ready to love them and care for them and equip them during their time in college, but also to engage with students who are coming who either don't have a church background or want nothing to do with the church, and we get the unique opportunity to walk with them, to share the gospel with them, and hopefully then send them back to your communities or to the nations or across the world to come back as people ready to serve churches like Harvest Chapel here in Clear Lake, to be a blessing to you. So Jonah, I don't know what you're doing after graduation, but if you come back here, our goal with you is that you would be a huge blessing to this church because of what you experienced over the last 4 years in our church family. And so that, if you wonder what animates Salt Company, that is our prayer, that God would use us in the lives of students in a pivotal way and during their time in college. And so for that reason, actually, Natalie and I, our elders have asked us to plant a church. And so not only am I the SALT director in Cedar Falls, but I'm also a church planting candidate. And we're going to be heading up to Mankato here in 2024 to start a church to love Minnesota State students. And so I love the fact that Clear Lake is the halfway point for us. My family lives in Ames. My wife's family is in Des Moines. So we've already stopped at the McDonald's off exit 194 on our way back from Mankato once. We're going to do that all the time. I'll be able to think about you guys every time we make that stop and eat McDonald's in the future. So we're going to be planting in Mankato here in a couple years, and we're super excited for that. Just another community that has thousands of students, and there are some good churches there, but as you talk to the pastors in the community, you begin to realize that there is very little church engagement in that community. One pastor was telling me of the 25,000 students in Mankato, he thinks there's only 175 involved in a church or campus ministry. Just a staggering need for more ministries and more churches to love those students. And so right now, Minnesota State has the reputation as being the place that you go and lose your faith. I was talking to one of our elders down in Cedar Falls. His wife is from Hutchinson, Minnesota, and she said 30 of my classmates went to Minnesota State when they graduated. They were all walking with Christ when they left, and they all walked away from him in college. And so that's the reputation that that school has. And our prayer is that God would use our church to be a part of changing the reputation of Minnesota State from the place where you go to lose your faith to the place where you go and find your faith. And so excited to share more with that. With you guys in the future with that, and even the long-term connection that I think that we can have just with how close Mankato is to you guys and everything. But what I've found already, even though we're in the early phase of planting this church, preparing, is I would say that there's already been at least 2 gut punch moments. Right? There's certain benchmarks when we kind of go through this preparation process of planting a church where we're like, okay, at this time we hope we're here, at this time we hope we're here. And there's already been some things that I thought in the timing that would have already taken place that haven't taken place. Prayers that I've prayed, God, would you work in this way at this time, and God hasn't answered it the way I thought. And I would say at least twice now there have been significant just gut punch, wind taken out of you moments where I thought God was going to work in a certain way, and then he didn't. And so right now, in both of those 2 areas, I am waiting. Just waiting. I don't know how God did answer in those situations the way I thought he would, and now I'm just waiting. Not knowing how God is going to answer with those particular situations, but waiting to see what he's going to do. And I know that in this early stage, that's only getting me prepared for what I anticipate, as exciting as planting a church will be, what I anticipate being multiple gut punch moments, where I have a certain idea of how God is going to work, and then he doesn't work that way. He doesn't work in my timing. He works in an unexpected way. And that doesn't just happen when you're starting a church. That every single one of us in this room has prayers that have not been answered the way that we thought they would. Every single one of us have areas in our life that we would say, yeah, I'm waiting for God in this area right now. Or I'm hoping that he'll work in this way or that way, and then he doesn't. Right? All of us have those moments, and the question as we face those in life is what continues to fuel our faith? What continues to give us confidence in God when we have unanswered prayers? When God isn't working the way that we expected him to work? When his timing doesn't align with our timing? Well, what we're going to see this morning in Mark chapter 5 is the story of a dad who goes to Jesus with a request. It's a very simple request. Will you heal my daughter? And what he thinks is a simple request and has an expectation of how Jesus is going to work. Jesus totally works in an unexpected way and leaves this dad in a confusing spot. So what fueled his faith in that moment? And if we can see that, we will see what will also fuel our faith when we face unanswered prayers and God working in unexpected ways. So in Mark chapter 5, we've got the story of Jairus and his daughter. The story starts in Mark chapter 5:21. So if you have a Bible, that is where we're going to be. Otherwise, Caden's going to throw up scripture as we go throughout this text. So here's the beginning of the story. Verse 21. It says, when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, my little daughter is dying. Come, lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live. So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. So here's the scene. Jesus and the disciples get back from healing a man plagued by demons right before this story. And when they get to shore, there's this distraught father, Jairus, a well-respected man in the community, a synagogue leader, and he comes with a request. My little daughter is dying. Will you heal her? Will you come with me? So Jesus agrees, and they begin to make this journey, but there's this crowd. So as this crowd is pressing against him, what happens next would have been totally unexpected for Jairus. Look at verse 25. Now a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. So here's another desperate person in the story. A woman who had this chronic illness for 12 years, and she had tried everything possible to try to cure this. She had seen doctors, she'd seen physicians, she had emptied her bank account trying to figure out a solution to her bleeding, and not only did it not help, she continued to get worse. Could you imagine the desperation that she would be feeling? Bank account empty. She's exhausted all the resources. She went to Mayo Clinic. She did everything you could. She saw the best physicians that you could, and yet was only getting worse. So she hears about Jesus, and she thinks, man, at this point, I've tried everything. I've heard this guy is healed. Maybe I can just touch his robe. Maybe I can just touch his clothes, and I'll be okay. And so that's what she does. She kind of weasels her way through the crowd. She gets up, she touches his clothes, instantly healed. An incredible moment, an incredible display of Jesus' power to heal. Now notice what Jesus decides to do next. Verse 30. Immediately, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Verse 31, his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, who touched me? But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Daughter, he said to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. So Jesus recognizes that this had happened. He pauses. He's like, who touched me? Which the disciples are like, are you crazy? Like, you see this crowd? This is like state fair traffic right now. Like, what are you talking about? Like, it could have been anybody, and yet you say, who touched me? But why was Jesus doing this? Jesus knew that there was this desperate woman, and he wanted to take the time to have a ministry moment with her, to show her compassion, to show her it wasn't just superstition that saved her. It was actually who he was as Jesus, God in the flesh. And so he stopped, he slowed down, and he took this fearful, superstitious, hurting woman, and he helped her understand what had happened to her. He helped her go from superstitious to a believer. Your faith has saved you. So he slows down, has this encounter with this woman. Now, imagine all of that. As great as this display of compassion is by Jesus, put yourself in Jairus' shoes at this point, right? What is Jairus thinking, right? He's probably looking at his watch. He's like, man, okay, I'm loving the moment with this woman, but remember my little girl? Well, what happens while Jesus is taking his time with this woman? Verse 35. While he was speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, don't be afraid, only believe. What would Jairus be thinking at this point? Right? It's like, Jesus, have you ever heard of triage? You've got someone who's had a chronic illness for 12 years. She'll still be here after you go heal my daughter. Right? Like you could heal my daughter and then come back. You're God, right? And yet, because of your delay, my daughter's dead. There was time before you stopped and had this great ministry moment, but because of this ministry moment, my daughter is now dead. In Jairus' mind, this would have been unexpected. Jesus is not operating the way he thought he would. He's ignoring the rules of triage. While he's caring for this afflicted woman, his daughter dies. But what does Jesus tell him? He says, don't be afraid, only believe. That must have been an interesting moment for Jairus, right? Jesus appears to be doing ministry backwards, and yet he is totally calm. As he looks at Jesus, Jesus is confident. He seems like he's in control of the moment, and Jairus is like, okay. And Jairus, full of faith, agrees. And so they continue on. Verse 37. He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, and James's brother. They came to the leader's house and saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him, and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha koum, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So they make it to Jairus' house. There's a large group mourning. There's a commotion, but Jesus takes this small group into the girl's room. And imagine that moment. Jesus sits down by her bed, holds her hand, and simply says, little girl, get up. This phrase, Talitha koum, it's not just like little girl, get up. It's not like this kind of impersonal command. It's actually a phrase that would have been reserved for like a father to his daughter. Like, honey, sweetie, get up. It's time to wake up. And you got this just amazing moment of tenderness and compassion of Jesus. And what's Jairus' response? He sat there astounded. Which he has gone on a roller coaster of a day. You start the day off on the shore, falling at Jesus' feet. He decides to come. You pause to have this ministry moment with this woman, but that leads to your daughter dying. Then you come in and you watch Jesus say, she's not dead, she's only asleep. And you're thinking, what? And then you go in and you watch Jesus say, sweetheart, it's time to wake up. And then your daughter lifts up as if she was only sleeping the whole time. Could you imagine? Of course, Jairus is astounded. He's amazed at what he had experienced. And then through the midst of it all, as he walked with Jesus and trusted him, he was full of faith and he believed. Even in the hard moments, even when Jesus was operating in a way he didn't expect, even when his request felt like it was going unanswered, he was able to have faith in Jesus. So that leaves us with a question. how can we have faith like Jairus? When it feels like God is taking us on a roller coaster, seems like he's going to work, and then he doesn't, it seems like there's a door open, then it closes, how can we continue to have faith like Jairus? How can we listen to what Jesus told Jairus? Don't be afraid, only believe. Right? Because there's times when just hearing like, hey, you just need to trust in Jesus. You just need to have faith in him. Just be confident in him. It can feel shallow. Right? When you're in the midst of unanswered prayer, seeing doors that you thought were open close, and someone says, hey, just trust God, as nice as that is, and as much as you know that's true, it can feel shallow at times. So how can we really have anchors that give us faith in the midst of unanswered prayer like Jairus? Well, I want to go back through the passage and show you two things we learn about Jesus in this story. And if we can see these two things, it will give us the fuel to have faith even when we face unanswered prayers. Here's the first. Look back at verse 34. How does Jesus refer to the woman? He says, daughter, your faith has saved you. Now, the interesting thing about him using the word daughter is this is one of the few times that Jesus would actually call someone a daughter or son in our accounts of the Gospels. So why does he choose this moment, this time, to call her daughter? Well, what he wanted to show Jairus and what he wanted to show us is there's not just one father who's suffering in this story with his daughter, but there's actually two. He wants to show Jairus that for the 12 years that Jairus has delighted in his little daughter, Jesus for 12 years has walked with his daughter through her chronic suffering. There's not one father and one daughter, there's two. Why is that important to us? Well, for some of us, we're convinced that our problems are too small for God. For some of us, we think that God has bigger concerns and he pays no attention to me. Or there's so many people, how could God have a personal interest in me? And what Jesus wanted this superstitious woman to know, and what he wants you to know, is that there is actually a suffering father walking with you. That Jesus knows what it's like to be a father who suffers. That he cares for you more than you could ever know. And if you're going to have faith in the midst of uncertain circumstances, you need to know that God is a father who loves you and has a deep concern for you. And is walking with you no matter what you're walking through. So that's the first anchor, that Jesus knows what it's like to be a suffering father. But what's the second anchor? Right? It's great to know that Jesus is with us and comforts us, but what gives us confidence that he can do anything about our problems? Well, look back down to what he says to the people. Right? He walks in, he says, hey, she's not dead, she's only sleeping. That's kind of a weird thing. Why would Jesus say that she's only sleeping? Well, if you think about the way he heals her, he didn't do some big display, grandiose display of power, right? How did he raise her? Sweetie, wake up. Why does Jesus call her death sleep? Well, he wanted you and Jairus to know that with Jesus, our greatest enemy, death, is no more than sleep. That the greatest threat to you and I is nothing more than a night's sleep with Jesus. He was able to so effortlessly raise her from the dead. Just this incredible display of power over the greatest enemy humans have ever faced. That is the power that Jesus has. Now, how could Jesus have that kind of power over our greatest enemy? Well, what this story points us to is another child who suffered. A child who had a prayer go unanswered. See, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed, Father, would you remove this cup of wrath from me? And he heard no. Jesus also knows what it's like to have an unanswered prayer. And it's because of that unanswered prayer that he went to the cross. So not only does this story show us that Jesus knows what it's like to suffer as a father, Jesus also knows what it's like to suffer as a child. And the only way that Jesus could so effortlessly lift this girl from death is if he lost his Father's hand on the cross. On the cross, Jesus heard, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus was a child who lost the hand of his Father so that the greatest enemy that you ever faced would be nothing more than sleep. Jesus is with you, and Jesus has conquered the greatest threat to your life. He's a father who knows what it's like to suffer, and he is a child who went to the cross to turn death into sleep for us. Those are the anchors that we have when we face unanswered prayers. Those are the anchors that fuel us with faith when we face uncertainty. Those are the anchors that give us confidence to not be afraid and only believe when God works in unexpected ways, when his timing doesn't align with our timing. And I know that many of you are walking through very real and very uncertain times. That the unanswered prayers in your life are not a small thing, they are a heavy thing. Children who are wayward, spouses who have cancer, a job that is uncertain, or an economic situation that your family's facing. Those are real things. Jairus' daughter, sick and dying, was a real thing. Jesus doesn't minimize the burdens that we carry, but he instead wants you to know that he is with you and he has conquered the greatest threat that you could ever face. Those are our anchors. I mentioned earlier that my mom went to IRBC in junior high and high school. And the reason why she didn't go to IRBC, if you're not familiar, it's a camp on the lake. I assume most of you are aware that there's a camp on the lake. The reason why she didn't go in elementary is because my grandfather was not a believer during her time in elementary. And my grandpa did not become a believer until my mom was 12 years old. And prior to him becoming a believer, he was an alcoholic and a despicable man. Now, that's not my grandma's story. My grandma became a believer at a Bible camp when she was 13 years old. And then her and my grandpa got married when she was 18. It's a crazy story. She said in 30 days, he came back from Germany. He was in the war. And he comes back, and in the time span of 30 days, they broke up. She went on a date with another guy, broke up with him, got back together with my grandpa, got married, and got pregnant, and she swears it wasn't a shotgun wedding. That is a wild month, okay? Crazy. So they get married when she's 18. And by the age of 21, she had 3 kids already. And so my 2 aunts and my mom were born all within like 28 months. I don't know if I might get that wrong. I shouldn't shoot off the hip on how much time. I know there's 11 months between my oldest aunt and my mom, and then 15 months between. So 11 plus 15, that's 26. Okay, there we go. Hey, we can do math on the spot in here. So 26 months, she goes from no kids to 3 kids, and she's 21 and has an alcoholic husband. And it wouldn't be for 12 years after my mom was born that my grandpa would give his life to Christ miraculously in May of 1978. And I've been thinking about how many Jairus moments did my grandma have as a 21-year-old girl with 3 daughters under the age of 3. And a husband who is alcoholic, disengaged, running around doing who knows what for 12 years. How many Jairus moments did my grandma have? One of my favorite parts of that story I've learned that it might be an exaggeration, but I still love it, is that in May 1978, my grandpa got connected with a guy in town who he went to high school with. He told him about this church that he should check out. And after my grandpa had tried everything the world had to offer to fill the hole in his life, he decided to give this church a try. And so the story goes that my grandpa walks in Sunday morning and says, "Ellen, we should go to church," and she fell back in her chair. She told me now, like, I didn't actually fall back in my chair, but I liked that version as a kid. And so they went to church for the first time together, even though my grandma had been a believer for so long. And 2 weeks after they went to church that Sunday, my grandpa surrendered his life to Christ. My mom would eventually come to know the gospel in children's church, and it wasn't until after she was 12 that she started coming to IRBC. But again, I just think about what those 12 years would have been like for my grandma. 12 years with an alcoholic husband, disengaged, doing who knows what. How many Jairus moments? And now, 50 years later, to have a grandfather that's been sober for over 50 years, and the joy that my grandma must have to look at a family that she has been able to see God do an incredible work through. All of my cousins are believers. All of her great-grandchildren are being raised in godly homes. It's not because there's something special in us, but it's because my grandma would tell you, in those 12 years, she found out that she had a father who walked with her, and a father who was more powerful than her situation. I don't know what Jairus moment you're facing right now. And I don't know the end of your Jairus story. But what I do know is that Jesus knows what it's like to be a father suffering with his daughter. And Jesus knows what it's like to be a child who is rejected by his father and suffered on our behalf so that he could defeat our greatest enemy, so that he could turn death into sleep. When you face unanswered prayers, anchor yourselves to those truths. Let's pray. God, there are so many of us that are facing situations right now that we don't know how you're going to work. Maybe we thought we knew how you would work, or we thought you would work a certain way, only to find out that you wouldn't work that way. And so we look to you. And we're so grateful that you are a God who would tell us, don't be afraid, only believe. But God, that's not an empty encouragement, but it's an encouragement because you are a Father who is walking with us, who cares deeply for each of us, that doesn't look at us and say our problems are too small for you. But God, you're a God who loves us and cares for us. And not only that, but God, you're a God who has power over all of our circumstances. There's no circumstance that we face that is outside of your control, outside of your authority, outside of your ability to work and intervene. And God, you proved that for us. When Christ heard a resounding no from heaven and went to a cross. God, he faced death so that death itself would only be asleep for us. God, I pray that those truths would fill us with faith, would give us a supernatural peace in the midst of our circumstances that can only be explained by a deep confidence in who you are. God, we pray that you would work in the midst of our circumstances, and God, that you would fill us with faith as we walk through them. Amen.